The envelope didn't just slide across the table. It stopped right in front of me like a decision had already been made. Robert Hayes kept his hand on it for a second longer than necessary. Not offering it, presenting it. The room was quiet. Too quiet. Crystal glasses, soft jazz, a perfect dinner, except it wasn't. Across from me sat my husband's parents, people who had already decided exactly who I was. "This should make things easier for everyone," Robert said. My husband didn't say a word. He didn't even look at me. I rested my hand on the envelope, but I didn't open it. I didn't need to. I already knew what was inside. Money. A clean exit. A polite way of saying, "You don't belong in this family." They thought I was just a broke army officer. Someone who got lucky and married into their world. What they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that my father owned $7 billion worth of shares in the very company Robert Hayes was so proud of. And that dinner? That was the moment everything they believed about me was about to fall apart. But to understand how I ended up sitting at that table, you have to understand who I am. My name is Emma Collins. I'm 37 years old, and I serve as a logistics officer in the United States Army. For the past 3 years, I've been stationed just outside Fort Belvoir, Virginia. My days aren't glamorous. They're built on schedules, supply chains, fuel reports, and making sure people have what they need before they even realize they need it. It's not the kind of job that turns heads in Washington, D.C., but it's the kind that keeps things running. I live about 20 minutes from base in a modest apartment. Brick building, small balcony, parking lot full of Fords, Chevys, and the occasional pickup. Inside, it's simple. A second-hand dining table, a couch I bought from a military family transferring to Texas. No designer furniture. No statement pieces, just a place that feels quiet at the end of a long day. That's how I was raised. My father used to tell me, "If you can't be comfortable without money, you'll never be comfortable with it." Back then, I thought it was just one of those life lessons parents repeat. I didn't realize how much weight those words actually carried. I met Daniel Hayes 4 years ago on a rainy October afternoon in a small coffee shop in Alexandria. The place was crowded, every seat taken, except for one across from a man in a tailored suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. He looked out of place, and somehow, so did I. "Feel free to share the table," he said. So I did. We talked about the usual things at first. Weather, traffic on I-95, work. He noticed my uniform folded over the back of my chair. "Army?" he asked. "Logistics," I said. He nodded like that meant something to him. An hour later, we were still talking. A week after that, we had dinner. 3 months later, we were seeing each other regularly. Daniel was a corporate attorney, long hours, big clients, the kind of career that comes with expectations. About 6 months in, he told me his father ran Hayes Industrial. I didn't react the way most people would, and that surprised him. What Daniel never understood, not then, anyway, was that I wasn't impressed by money. I was watching something else. I was watching how he treated someone he believed had none, and for a long time, he treated me well. That's the part people don't expect. When someone believes you don't come from money, they show you a version of themselves that isn't filtered through expectation or advantage. With Daniel, in the beginning, that version felt genuine. He opened doors, not just literally, but in the way he made space for me in his life. He asked about my work. He listened, or at least, I thought he did. But over time, I started to notice something subtle. Daniel didn't just accept that I lived simply. He liked it. There was a certain pride in the way he talked about it to others. "Emma's different," he'd say. "She's not into all that." And at first, I took that as a compliment. But the more I listened, the more I realized what he really meant. He liked being the successful one, the provider, the man with the bigger future. And in his mind, I was the steady, grounded counterpart, the one who didn't complicate things with ambition or expectations beyond my uniform and my paycheck. The truth is, I let him believe it, not because I was trying to deceive him, but because I wanted to understand something that mattered a lot more than money. Would he still respect me if he thought I had nothing to offer but myself? That question stayed with me longer than I expected. The first time Daniel came over to my apartment, he looked around with quiet curiosity. He didn't say anything right away, but I could see it in his eyes, the mental checklist. Small place. Used furniture. No signs of wealth. "You don't live like most people in D.C., he finally said. I shrugged. I'm in the army. We don't really do showing off. He smiled at that. I like that, and I believed him. When we got married 2 years later, it was a small ceremony. Nothing extravagant. Just a few close friends, a simple venue in Virginia, and my father standing quietly off to the side in an old jacket he'd probably owned longer than Daniel had been practicing law. Daniel shook his hand and said, "I'll take care of her." My father just nodded. "I expect you will." There were no discussions about money, no questions about family assets or investments, and my father didn't offer anything more than what was asked, because no one asked. That was the part that stayed with me. Daniel never once sat down and said, "Tell me about your family." Not in any real sense, not beyond surface-level details. He knew my father had worked in construction. He knew I grew up modestly, and that was enough for him to form a complete picture. A picture that wasn't wrong, just incomplete. And incomplete assumptions have a way of becoming dangerous when people start believing them as fact. Looking back now, I can see exactly when that misunderstanding stopped being harmless. It wasn't during our wedding. It wasn't even in the first year of our marriage. It was the moment Daniel started measuring things quietly, almost unconsciously. Where we lived, what I earned, what I didn't ask for. And somewhere along the way, without ever saying it out loud, he placed me in a category. Not equal. Not quite. Just different. And the truth is, I saw it happening. I just didn't stop it. Because a part of me still wanted to believe that when it really mattered, when things were tested, he would choose me over that assumption. I didn't realize then how much that belief was about to be tested, or how expensive that silence would become, and it was tested sooner than I expected. About a year into our marriage, Daniel came home one evening, loosened his tie, and said it like it was just another item on his calendar. "My parents want to have dinner with us next Friday." I remember looking up from the kitchen table, a stack of logistics reports spread out in front of me. "They haven't met me yet?" I asked. "They've been busy," he said quickly. "Travel, work, you know how it is." I didn't. Not really. But I nodded anyway. Then he added something that stuck with me. "They're particular about people." I gave a small smile. "I've dealt with Army colonels. I think I can manage." He laughed, but there was a tightness in it I didn't fully understand at the time. The night of the dinner, the air had that crisp, early fall feel. Virginia gets in October. Cool enough to notice, not cold enough for a coat. I changed out of my uniform and into a simple navy dress. Nothing flashy. Nothing that looked like I was trying to impress anyone. Because I wasn't. Daniel picked me up a little after 6 p.m. in his gray Mercedes. The drive from my apartment to Arlington took about 40 minutes, and the closer we got, the quieter the neighborhoods became. Bigger houses, longer driveways, fewer street lights. When we pulled up to his parents' home, it didn't look like a house. It looked like a statement. White columns, a wide front porch, perfectly trimmed hedges, the kind of place that probably sat on a couple of acres and hosted more fundraisers than family dinners. "You okay?" Daniel asked as he turned off the engine. I glanced at the house, then back at him. "I've been shot at before," I said lightly. "I think I can handle dinner." He smiled, but again, that tightness. Inside, everything was exactly what you'd expect. Polished hardwood floors, oil paintings on the walls, furniture that looked like it had never been sat in without permission. Margaret Hayes met us in the foyer, tall, composed, the kind of presence that filled a room without raising her voice. "Emma," she said, offering her hand. "Nice to finally meet you." "Nice to meet you too, ma'am." Her grip was firm, but brief. Her eyes moved over me quickly, taking inventory. "Daniel tells us you're in the army." "Yes, ma'am." She nodded once. "That's an interesting path." Before I could respond, Robert Hayes stepped in from the adjoining room. "Let the girl come in, Margaret," he said. Then he turned to me. "Welcome, Emma." "Thank you, sir." Dinner was already set when we sat down. 4 place settings, crystal glasses, a chandelier casting soft light across the table. A housekeeper served the first course and disappeared without a sound. For the first few minutes, everything felt normal. Controlled, polite. Robert asked about my job. "So, logistics," he said. "That's mostly paperwork and trucks, right?" I smiled. "Sometimes trucks, sometimes helicopters. Depends on the week." He nodded slowly, like he was filing that away. "And long term?" he asked. What's the plan? I'll stay in as long as the army will have me. Margaret set her fork down. That can't pay very much. Daniel shifted slightly in his chair. It's not really about the money, Mom. Of course not, she said smoothly, though her tone suggested she didn't quite believe that. Then came the questions about my family. What did your parents do? Robert asked. My father worked in construction, I said. Worked? Margaret asked. He's retired now. Another nod. Another quiet assessment. I could feel it forming beneath the surface. Not hostility. Not even rudeness. Just certainty. They had already decided who I was. And I let them, because my father's voice was still there in the back of my mind. Let people show you who they are. Halfway through the meal, Margaret excused herself and stepped out of the room. When she returned, Robert was holding that cream-colored envelope. At first, I thought it might be documents for Daniel, something business-related, but Robert didn't hand it to his son. He slid it across the table, right toward me. The room went quiet. Daniel cleared his throat. Dad. Robert raised a hand slightly. Let me speak. He looked directly at me. Emma, I hope you understand this comes from a place of practicality. I didn't touch the envelope yet. Practicality? I asked. Our family has certain expectations, he said. Margaret folded her hands neatly in front of her. We want what's best for Daniel. There it was. Clear enough. Robert tapped the envelope lightly. Inside is a check, he said. And an agreement. What kind of agreement? A clean separation, Margaret said. Daniel said nothing. Not a word. And in that moment, everything I had been quietly wondering about him stopped being a question. And once it stopped being a question, it became a decision. I reached for the envelope. Not quickly. Not angrily. Just steadily. The paper felt heavier than it should have. Thick. Expensive. The kind of envelope that was meant to carry something important. I opened it and glanced inside. A check. Large enough to buy a small house outright in most parts of Virginia. And a document. Clean. Precise. Already prepared by their attorneys. They hadn't come to talk. They had come to conclude. I folded the paper back down and slid it neatly into the envelope again. Then I placed it on the table in front of me and looked at Daniel. He still wouldn't meet my eyes. That hurt more than anything his parents had said. You think I married Daniel for money? I asked, turning back to Robert. He didn't answer, but he didn't deny it either. Margaret gave a soft, measured smile. We're trying to prevent complications down the road. Complications. I let that word sit there for a second. Then I nodded slowly. I see. And the truth is, I did. Families like theirs build walls over time. Around money, around reputation, around anything that might threaten what they've spent decades creating. I understood the instinct. What I didn't accept was the way they chose to act on it. I slid the envelope back across the table, right to where it had started. I've already decided, I said. Robert's expression tightened slightly. You're declining? Yes. May I ask why? I met his eyes evenly. Because I didn't marry Daniel for money. Then I turned back to my husband. I married him because I believed he respected me. Daniel finally looked up. I do respect you, he said. Then why didn't you say anything? He opened his mouth, and nothing came out. That silence answered the question better than words ever could. I sat there for a moment, letting it settle. Not just for them, but for me. Because something inside me had shifted, and I needed to be sure I understood it clearly. This wasn't about the check. It wasn't even about his parents. It was about the man sitting across from me, and what he chose to do when it mattered. I stood up. I appreciate dinner, I said calmly. Margaret's voice softened just slightly. You don't have to leave upset. I'm not upset, I replied. And that was the truth. I wasn't angry. I wasn't shaken. I was clear about where I stood, clear about what this marriage actually looked like beneath the surface. I glanced once more at the envelope resting near Robert's hand. You may want to keep that, I added. He frowned. Why? I held his gaze for a second longer than necessary. You might need it more than you think. For the first time that evening, he looked uncertain. Daniel followed me out to the driveway. The air felt cooler now, sharper. You embarrassed them, he said. I turned toward him. Did I? They were trying to handle this quietly. Quietly? I repeated. Daniel, they tried to buy your wife. He exhaled, frustrated. You're making it sound worse than it was. That stopped me. not because it surprised me, but because it confirmed everything. Worse than it was, I said slowly. He rubbed his forehead. My father built that company from nothing. That's not entirely true, I replied. He looked at me, confused. What does that mean? But I didn't answer. Because that conversation didn't belong in a driveway. It belonged somewhere much more appropriate. I opened my car door and paused for a moment. I'm going to see my father, I said. At this hour? Yes. Why? I looked at him one last time. Because I think it's time your family learned something about their company. He frowned. Emma, what are you talking about? I gave a small, tired smile. You'll see soon enough. And then I drove away. I didn't rush. That's something the army teaches you. When everything inside you wants to react, you slow down instead. The drive to my father's place took a little over an hour. Out of Arlington, across the river, into quieter roads where the streetlights thin out and the houses sit farther apart. By the time I pulled into his gravel driveway, the porch light was already on. It usually was. My father believed a light on at night kept trouble away. When I knocked, he opened the door almost immediately, like he'd been expecting me. Emma, he said, studying my face. Everything all right? Not exactly. He stepped aside and let me in. Same house I grew up in. Same worn kitchen table. Same faint smell of coffee and wood. I sat down, and for the next few minutes, I told him everything. The dinner. The questions. The envelope. He didn't interrupt. He just listened. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and let out a slow breath. Well, he said, that's something. I almost smiled. That's one way to put it. He reached for the coffee pot and poured us both a cup, like it was just another evening. Like we were talking about weather instead of something that had just cracked open my marriage. You want to get back at them? He asked. I shook my head. No. Good, he said simply. That gets expensive. I looked down at my hands for a moment. I don't want revenge, I said. I just want them to understand something. What's that? I met his eyes. That you can't measure someone's value by what you think is in their bank account. He nodded slowly. Not surprised. Just satisfied. That's fair, he said. There was a short silence. Then he leaned back again, rubbing his chin the way he always did when he was thinking through a problem. Well, he said, almost casually, if they want to talk about money. He stood up, walked over to the drawer beside the sink, and pulled out a thin folder. Maybe it's time they met their biggest shareholder. I looked at him. Even though I'd known about his investments for years, hearing it in that context landed differently. You're serious. He opened the folder and slid a document across the table toward me. I glanced down. Numbers. Percentages. Ownership breakdown. And there it was. $7 billion. Not in cash, not in some flashy account, but in shares. Quietly held, quietly grown over decades. You're still the largest individual shareholder? I asked. Give or take depending on the market, he said. Does Robert Hayes know? He shook his head. No reason he would. I leaned back in my chair, letting that settle. The man who had just tried to buy me out of his son's life didn't even know who really held power inside his own company. My father picked up his coffee again. I didn't invest in that company because of Robert, he said. I invested because 25 years ago they had good engineers and bad management. They needed quiet capital. And you gave it to them. I gave them room to grow, he corrected. That sounded exactly like him. No spotlight, no control, just presence. So what do we do? I asked. He looked at me for a long moment. What do you want to do? I thought about it. About the dinner. About Daniel. About that envelope sliding across the table like I was something that could be negotiated. I want them to see it, I said finally. See what? The truth. He nodded once. Then we don't make noise, he said. We don't argue. We don't threaten. What do we do? A small smile crossed his face. We show up. We showed up the following Thursday. Hayes Industrial's headquarters sits in downtown Washington, D.C., a glass tower just a few blocks from the National Mall. I had driven past it dozens of times over the years without thinking twice. That morning, it felt different, because this time, I wasn't walking in as someone's wife. I was walking in as the daughter of the man who owned more of that company than anyone else in the room. My father pulled into the garage beside me in his old Ford pickup. It looked out of place, surrounded by black SUVs and luxury sedans, but he didn't seem to notice. He never did. You ready? He asked as he stepped out. As I'll ever be. He gave a small nod. Remember, we're not here to fight. I know, I said. We're here to remind. We took the elevator up to the executive floor. A couple of men in suits stood inside with us, flipping through folders, barely glancing up until they noticed my father's jacket, his boots, the keys in his hand. That look, I'd seen it before. Assumption. Made in a second. The doors opened to a quiet reception area. A woman behind the desk looked up. Good morning. Can I help you? My father stepped forward. Richard Collins. I'm here for the board meeting. She typed his name into her system and paused. Her expression shifted. One moment, sir. She picked up the phone, spoke quietly, then set it back down. You can go right in. The boardroom doors were already open. Inside, about a dozen people sat around a long, polished table. Robert Hayes stood at the far end, mid-conversation. Daniel sat halfway down, reviewing documents. The moment we stepped in, the room changed. Conversation stopped. Robert turned toward the door, irritation flickering across his face until the company attorney leaned in and whispered something to him. I watched it happen in real time. Confusion. Recognition. Then something very close to shock. Mr. Collins, Robert said slowly. My father nodded. Morning. His voice was calm. Even. Like he'd just walked into any other meeting. I took a seat beside him without saying a word. The attorney cleared his throat. For the record, he said carefully, Mr. Collins holds approximately $7 billion in Hayes Industrial shares, making him the largest individual shareholder. You could feel that number land. $7 billion. It didn't echo loudly, but it settled heavily. Chairs shifted. Papers stopped moving. One of the directors leaned back, looking from my father to Robert like he was trying to recalculate everything he thought he knew about the company. Robert's jaw tightened. Daniel was staring at me. Emma, he said quietly. I met his eyes. Hello, Daniel. His expression didn't just show surprise. It showed something deeper. Realization. You didn't tell me, he said. Before I could answer, my father spoke. My daughter prefers people to know her before they know her bank account. No one smiled, because everyone understood exactly what that meant. Robert took a slow breath. You're saying Emma is your daughter. That's correct. And you've been a shareholder in this company for what, 25 years? Just about. Robert looked around the room, then back at my father. You never disclosed this connection to my family. My father shrugged slightly. No one asked. Silence. Not the polite kind from dinner. This was different. This was the kind of silence that comes when the ground shifts under your feet and you realize you've been standing in the wrong place the entire time. Robert finally spoke again, his voice more measured now. This is unexpected. I imagine it is, my father said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. He didn't have to, because the truth was already doing the work for him. Daniel leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. The dinner, he said under his breath. I didn't respond. I didn't need to, because in that moment, every assumption, every quiet judgment, every word left unsaid at that table had just walked into the room with us and taken a seat at the head of it. And once the truth is in the room, it doesn't leave quietly. The meeting continued, at least on paper. People spoke about quarterly projections, supply chain costs, contracts across the Midwest normal business. But nothing about it felt normal anymore, because every person at that table knew what had just happened. Not just the number, not just the ownership, but the fact that a man sitting in a worn jacket, who had said almost nothing, held more influence in that room than anyone else, including the man who ran the company. My father didn't interrupt. He didn't challenge anyone. He simply listened, and somehow, that made it heavier. When the meeting finally ended, the room cleared out slower than usual. A few board members came over to shake my father's hand, their tone noticeably different now, more respectful, more careful. I remember when you first invested, one of them said. Good to see you again, said another. My father just nodded politely, like none of this was new to him. Eventually, the room emptied until only 4 of us remained. Robert, Daniel, my father, and me. The silence this time wasn't tense. It was exposed. Robert was the first to speak. I think we owe each other an explanation. My father nodded. That seems reasonable. Robert turned to me. Emma, I had no idea. I know, I said. A pause. If I had known, he continued, That situation at dinner would have been handled very differently. My father leaned forward slightly. Would it? He asked. Robert didn't answer right away. Because he couldn't. Not honestly. He shifted his weight, then tried again. We've spent decades building this company. We've had people come after this family for money. You understand that? I do, my father said. Caution is part of business. Robert nodded, relieved to find common ground. But, my father added calmly, there's a difference between caution and disrespect. That landed, harder than anything else that had been said all morning. Robert looked down at the table for a moment. I misjudged you, he said finally, looking back at me. I know, I replied, and I did. Because the truth was, this had never just been about money. It was about what they believed money represented. I stepped forward slightly. You didn't just misjudge me, I said. You decided what my life was worth based on what you thought I didn't have. Robert opened his mouth, then stopped. Because there wasn't a clean way to argue with that. Margaret's voice echoed in my memory from that dinner. That can't pay very much. I let that sit in the air. I wear a uniform, I continued. I serve. That may not come with a 7-figure salary, but it's not something to look down on. My father stepped beside me. My daughter chose to serve her country, he said quietly. I consider that a greater measure of character than most things money can buy. No one challenged that. Not Robert. Not Daniel. Daniel finally spoke, his voice lower than I'd ever heard it. I should have said something, he admitted. I looked at him. Yes, I said. You should have. He nodded, taking it without defense this time. My father straightened slightly, glancing around the room one last time. I didn't come here to interfere with your company, he said. I've always believed it was worth supporting. Robert gave a small nod. It is. I came here, my father continued, to make sure something was understood. Robert met his eyes. That people don't reveal their value through their bank accounts, my father said. They reveal it through how they treat others, especially when they think those people have nothing. The room went quiet again. But this time, it wasn't uncomfortable. It was reflective, because the lesson had already been delivered. No anger, no threats, just truth. And sometimes, that's the only thing that actually changes anything. And when the room finally cleared, the real conversation began. Not about the company, not about money, about us. Daniel was still standing by the window when I walked back in. The city stretched out behind him, traffic moving slowly, people going about their day, completely unaware that something had just shifted inside that building. He didn't turn right away. For a moment, he just stood there, staring down like he was trying to find the version of himself he had lost somewhere along the way. I owe you more than an apology, he said finally. I pulled out a chair and sat down across from him. Then start with the truth. He nodded, slow and deliberate. The truth is, I was afraid. Of what? I asked. He let out a breath. My parents. The company. Everything that comes with it. I didn't interrupt. When you grow up in a family like mine, he continued, you don't just inherit money, you inherit expectations. You learn to protect what's been built, to question anyone who might threaten it. And I was a threat? I asked. He shook his head quickly. No, not really. But I let them believe you were. That landed harder than I expected. Because it wasn't just silence anymore. It was permission. I should have said something that night, he said, the moment that envelope hit the table. Yes, I said. You should have. He accepted that without argument. No excuse. No shifting blame. Just acceptance. I kept telling myself it wasn't as bad as it looked, he said quietly. That they were just being careful. That it would pass. And did you believe that? I asked. He hesitated. Part of me did, he admitted. But the rest of me knew exactly what was happening. I leaned back slightly, studying him. And you chose not to act. Yes. There it was. Simple. Honest. Late. We sat in silence for a moment. Then he said something I didn't expect. I resigned this morning. I looked up. From the firm? He nodded. Why? He let out a small, tired breath. Because I realized something after you left that night. I waited. I've spent my entire career protecting contracts, assets, corporate interests, he said. And when it mattered most, I didn't protect my own wife. That didn't erase anything. But it mattered. What are you going to do now? I asked. I've been talking to a legal nonprofit, he said. They work with veterans. Disability claims, housing disputes, employment issues. Veterans? I repeated. He nodded. Turns out there are a lot of people who served this country who need someone in their corner. I let that sink in. You'd walk away from all of it? I asked. The money? The position? He gave a small, almost self-aware smile. I think I've had enough of making decisions based on money. For the first time since that dinner, something shifted inside me. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But something lighter. I didn't hide my background to test you, I said. I know, he replied. You did it to live honestly. Yes, and I failed you anyway. I didn't argue with that, because it was true. Are you leaving me? He asked. The question hung there, honest, direct, and heavier than anything else we had said. I don't know, I answered. He nodded slowly. That's fair. I studied him for a moment. People don't change because they say the right things. They change because they're willing to live differently after they've said them. You'll have to earn my trust again, I said. I will. It might take time. I have time. That answer felt different, steady. For the first time in days, I believed he understood what that meant. Not promises, not words, time, and the choices you make with it. Time has a way of showing you whether someone meant what they said or just needed to say it in the moment. The weeks that followed weren't dramatic. No big arguments, no grand gestures, just small things, consistent things. Daniel moved out of his office downtown and started working with that nonprofit. His hours changed, his priorities changed. I started noticing the difference in the way he talked less about billable hours and clients, more about people, real people. Veterans trying to keep their homes, families trying to navigate systems that weren't built to be easy. He didn't talk about it like it was a sacrifice. He talked about it like it mattered. And that was new. We didn't pretend everything was fixed. We didn't suddenly go back to how things were before that dinner. Some things don't go back. They either move forward or they don't survive. We took it one day at a time. Conversations that used to be easy became more honest, sometimes uncomfortable, but honest in a way they hadn't been before. A few weeks later, we drove out to my father's place together. It was late afternoon, the sun sitting low over the trees, casting that warm light across the porch. He was already outside when we pulled in, sitting in his chair with a cup of coffee like he had nowhere else to be. He looked up as we walked toward him. Well, he said with a small grin, looks like you two are still speaking. Daniel let out a quiet laugh. Yes, sir. My father studied him for a moment, not judging, just observing. You learning anything lately? He asked. Daniel nodded. A lot. That's a good start. We sat down together. No tension, no performance, just three people having a conversation. At one point, my father glanced at both of us and said, Life's a lot simpler when people sit down and talk instead of sliding envelopes across tables. Daniel looked down for a second, then nodded. I understand that now, and I believed him. Not because everything was fixed, but because he had changed something that actually mattered. Forgiveness, I realized, isn't a single moment. It's a process. It's watching someone choose differently, over and over again. As the sun dipped lower and the air cooled, I looked at the two men sitting across from me, one who had never needed money to prove who he was, and one who was finally learning that lesson the hard way. And for the first time since that envelope touched the table, I felt like, maybe, just maybe, we had a future worth rebuilding. Looking back now, I realized that night was never really about money. It just revealed everything else. Money has a way of doing that. It doesn't change who you are, it shows it. It strips things down to the choices you make when you think no one's keeping score. How you treat people when you believe they have nothing to offer you. That's the real measure. I've worn a uniform most of my adult life. I've worked long days for a paycheck that won't impress anyone in a boardroom. But I've never measured my worth in dollars, and I never will. Because respect isn't something you buy, and character isn't something you inherit. I've seen a man with billions sit quietly at a kitchen table, treating everyone the same. And I've seen people with everything still believe they're owed more. The difference isn't money, it's values. And if there's one thing this whole experience taught me, it's this. Never decide who someone is based on what you think they have. Because sometimes, the people you underestimate the most are the ones holding everything together. This story reminds us that money does not create character, it reveals it. The real test of a person is how they treat others when there is nothing obvious to gain. It also shows that silence in important moments can wound as deeply as open disrespect. In everyday life, we should be careful not to measure people by salary, status, or appearances, because those things rarely tell the whole story. Respect, loyalty, humility, and courage matter more. And when trust is broken, forgiveness is possible, but only when it is followed by steady change, honest action, and time.